Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Robots Are Coming. And today we will be interviewing Professor Chilton, Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, and Walter Mandar Research Scholar. You have ongoing projects that include researching on how to improve the quality of life in India's projects. And my name is Ken Hin, your host with The Robots Are Coming. Let's get started.
Thanks for the introduction, Ken, and thanks for having me here today. Now, as Ken mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Chicago Law School, and I do research on a range of topics, mostly at the intersection of international comparative law, and a lot of it with a focus on trying to understand potential ways that law could be leveraged to promote economic development and the promotion of human rights around the world.
And you're also a professor at among the best and most prestigious law schools in the world, the University of Chicago Law School. And as you mentioned, you deal with qualitative interviews and household level quantitative surveys in slums across India to assess the impact of slum notifications. My question to you is, why are you conducting this study now, and why this study in particular?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So my colleague here at the University of Chicago, Anoop Milani, and I started doing research on slums in India about 6 years ago. And let me tell you a little bit of why we think it's just a topic of first order importance. So there's something like 750 million people in the world that live in extreme poverty. So these are people that live on less than $1.90 a day. And of those 750 million, roughly, the largest concentration of them is in India. And also, regardless of country, most of them are people in rural environments. So think subsistence level agriculture. That's where people are really still scraping by in just absolute extreme abject poverty. Now, in India, specifically, where you have the highest concentration of people that are in extreme poverty, and most of them are in rural places, you also have the largest urban-rural wealth gap in the world. Now, there's everywhere essentially has urban-rural wealth gaps. That is, you make more money if you live in cities than if you live in rural areas. But that's especially true in India. So people with the same skill sets, the same level of education, the same age, health, demographics, whatever, in expectation would earn more money in a city. And so the question that we got interested in is, if you care about eliminating extreme poverty in India or around the world, it seems like the biggest thing we need to figure out how to do is to get people that are in rural subsistence level agriculture and rural poverty and figure out how to get them into cities. And in much of the developing world, the way that people get a foot on the door of cities is slums. And so that is to live in informal communities without secure property rights within these cities. So the idea being people move from rural India into the slums of Mumbai or Delhi or Bangalore or where have you. And we wanted to understand how that happens, why it happens, and how to do better. Now, the specific thing you asked me was not just why India and why slums, but why bother to do surveys or qualitative interviews. Now, both me and my collaborator on this project, Anoop Milani, both have backgrounds in quantitative empirical research. But in this case, we realized that although there might be data sets that exist where people have some data on urban poverty or on rural poverty or some demographic information or whatever it is, that it's just populations and communities that big data alone does a really poor job capturing their life experience. And so what we realize is we just have to, both ourselves and with researchers working with us and with partners, spend time in these communities and do face-to-face interviews and try to immerse ourselves in them. And so we've tried to do interviews in cities across India at a large scale, where with our own team of researchers just spending time in these communities to try to get a better sense of what's going on and what's wrong, what's broken, what can be fixed, et cetera.
And it seems like there is an increase in urbanization in India's urban population, as the population is expected to grow by 250 million people between now and 2030. I'm curious to hear what the broad objectives of this project are, Professor.
Great. So really twofold. The first is to understand what laws could be changed that could be help to improve the experiences of the urban poor. So how can we change policies around housing or water or the provision of electricities or education, whatever it may be, that make the lives of those people that you're mentioning that are going to be flooding into cities a little easier and a little better. And the second thing that's a goal of this project is not just to generate new ideas around this, but to do a better job communicating those ideas. Now, this is something, because academics, that we don't necessarily always do a great job on. But in this case, we're at least trying to get the ideas that we've been generating out to the public. And so, for instance, one method that we've done this is that we have make a documentary to just take people into the communities where we've been doing research, introduce them to people that live there, and let those people in their own voices explain their experience and their problems. And so our hope is that we can get this on the TVs of policymakers in India and in other countries around the world where they have issues related to urban poverty. So the goals are both to identify the laws that can be changed, but also try to raise awareness in ways to create the political will to actually change them.
Now let's talk about your documentary, Basti. In the documentary, there's a lot of buzz around the effects of rent control on the people of India living in the slums. Could you tell our audience about, first of all, what rent control really is?
Yeah, sure. So to be clear, India, like many countries in the world, has a problem where the formal housing market just is not providing enough homes or enough homes at affordable prices for all of the people that live in the city or would like to live in the city. And so, for instance, you have Mumbai, the largest city in India, that has a substantial portion of the population, by some estimates as much as half, millions of people that are living in slums and informal housing. Now, one of the things that's causing that is resulting in a lack of supply of formal housing is rent control laws. But to be clear, it's just one piece, but it's one piece that where the law's gone a little wrong. So let me explain this in rough contours, which is roughly speaking, that all the way back during World War II, when the British were trying to leverage the resources of India to help in the war effort, a lot of people, material, companies, goods, all were moved to the ports of Mumbai, and rent in Mumbai got really expensive. So after independence in 1947, a law was passed to freeze rents in place and to only let the rents of existing renters go up very, very small over time. Now, in practice, what this ended up being is, in effect, just an expropriation of the property from the owners of the land to the renters, right? Because all of a sudden, if you own this property, the person that was renting from it, you couldn't kick them out, and they didn't have to pay you market rents for these prices. Now, the effect that that's had is that, in general, no one wants to go in the business of building rental properties in Mumbai because you worry that you're not actually going to get paid the market price for doing that. And so the result is people just don't build the kinds of apartment buildings and rent them out at the prices we need, because people, one of the reasons that people are concerned about this is these rent control laws that can make it impossible to get the return on the investment that it would take to build new buildings in these big cities.
And in many big cities around, in particular the United States, and in particularly and then the San Francisco Bay Area, there has been rent control that has the goal of maintaining a base of affordable rental housing for both low and moderate income tenants. What are some of the consequences that you see with rent control, and what are some of the key considerations out in the slums of India?
Yeah, so rent control laws are at least justified for these kinds of noble aims that are laudable, which is to maintain a base of low and affordable housing for low-income people, so that they can continue to live in the city, so that they won't be priced out of it. And that should be something that matters to all of us, that we want to, in the cities that we live in, whether it's Chicago or San Francisco or Mumbai, to make sure that members of our community can continue to afford to live here. And also, there's just a lot of jobs that don't pay particularly high wages that are extremely necessary. And so we want those people to be able to live in the cities where they work, and to be able to get to work, whether or not it's working in service industries or in city government or in schools or wherever it is that we think this is important. Now, The issue with rent control laws, although they may be justified in these ways, is that they have the effect of radically restricting the supply of housing that gets built, because people are likely to build less housing in situations where you're not going to be able to get a full return for that investment, right? People that are choosing to invest in housing or developing have other options and other places to go with their money. And if you say, look, if you build housing, you won't get a full market return on it, why build housing? And the result is that over time, when cities pass rent control laws, if they continue to enforce them strictly, their housing supply just does not keep up with the demands of the population. Now, this is one instance, and in urban poverty situations, you see this again and again, where these well-seeming, meaning laws distort markets in ways that has the effect of hurting the people that they're intended to help. And so rent control laws in many cases end up benefiting sort of long-term incumbent residents that in many cases are no longer particularly poor, but at the expense of either the poor people that either currently live in the city or would like to.
There's an argument out there that rent control could also offer potential benefits for tenants around the world, whether it's in Chicago, Mumbai, or in San Francisco. For example, rent control provides insurance against rent increases and potentially limiting displacement. And according to affordable housing advocates by the Brookings Institute, these insurance benefits are valuable to tenants. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, rent control laws limit yearly rent increases to a maximum of 10%. And according to the San Francisco Tenants Association, they argue that property rights are not only rights, rather there is an idea to having rights to decent and affordable housing.
Got it. A few thoughts on this. So first, the degree to which the rent control law is going to restrict housing depends entirely on how much it requires the price of the rent to be divorced from market forces. And so if you can allow 10% increase, maybe in most years, that's roughly keeping pace with inflation or the housing market, what it would be in a natural state without the rent control policies in place. But in some situations, the rent control laws are so strict that the rent doesn't increase 10% over the course of decades, right? And Mumbai is closer to that case, where the prices in rent control units are just look more familiar to someone from the 1940s than from the 2020s. But the second thing that I'd say is, if our goal is to make rent or housing more affordable, there's really two levers that we can do this much more effectively. The first is just to make it really easy to build housing, and the greater we increase the supply, the lower the cost is going to be. And the mistake that San Francisco has made, for instance, is made it so difficult to build housing. It doesn't matter what rent control laws you put in effect, that it's become just near impossible to build buildings, and you get very few new units a year. And so instead, if we just radically increase supply, the inflation of housing prices won't happen as strictly. And you see exactly this play out in the data when you compare housing prices historically in, let's say, Tokyo, which makes it easy to build, to San Francisco, where even though at points in history they were similar cities, now they are not similar at all in terms of the housing stock or the housing prices. The second thing is, not only should we just build more units, but if our goal is to get money into the hands of low-income people, we can do this in a more targeted way that's less distortionary if we just identify some income threshold, some wealth threshold through which we subsidize through tax and transfer systems. So for instance, rent control units in many cases are like, owned by someone that's actually relatively well off, but they just happen to live in the unit for a long time or whatever it may be. Much more effective to let the unit price just adjust to whatever the market rate is. And if we think that there's people that deserve or need or would benefit from greater government support, we can increase the share of the EITC, we can lower their income taxes, we can get them the money they need to pay their rent directly without just trying to take the money, so to speak, from the developers or for the landowners, because there's a cost for doing it that way. And the cost for taking the money in the form of reducing the rent they can charge just means there's less units. And I think predictably, cities that lean on rent control have really bad housing supply problems around the world.
And looking outward from this, is there a way we can change the incentive structure for politicians, specifically in India, to encourage them to best help the people living in the slums? Or should it be left in the hands of private corporations?
Yeah. good question. So I think that that this area around housing is one that's proven very difficult around the world, to create the right conditions such that the political leaders are responsive to the needs of low-income people. And the reason is that the incumbents are the ones, that is, the people that already live in a city. They're the ones that benefit from the restrictions on housing supply or the restrictions on housing policies, and they just have a much easier time voting, organizing, influencing the elected officials. And so in India, just like in the United States, it's then difficult to change many of these rules around restrictive housing policies. Now, I hope in general that it may be possible to explain to people, or to convince more voters, that these policies that are justified of helping the poor are actually hurting them. And this is a case where if you think that rent control laws are in any way benefiting, the urban poor of Mumbai, that is not true. It is making it radically more likely that they're going to live in a slum instead of a more permanent or secure building with greater housing security. Now, I'm not sure that that'll be something that is possible to convince politicians, but maybe by continuing to make these arguments and get them into the public discourse, it can hopefully move in that direction. And I think in the US, you've seen it a little. There is much more of a YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement, where there's a rise of people that are making the argument, actually, let's grow in our community and let's start building. And I think that was something we didn't see even 10 years ago.
And definitely the YIMBY movement is in contrast and opposition to the NIMBY phenomenon that happens out in Berkeley a lot.
Yeah, that's right. I should have been more clear here, right? So NIMBY is not in my backyard. And this is the idea where people that already live in a community get together and try to protest new building. And they might say that the new building will cause too much traffic, that the new building will result in decreases in public safety, that the new buildings will hurt the environment or change the culture of the city. Now, these NIMBY arguments are popular everywhere, but even in extremely liberal and progressive places like Berkeley, California, that has famously effective NIMBY movements that protest new construction, and have this consequence of then really raising rents. And so, in the case of Berkeley, perhaps some elements of the character of Berkeley have been maintained, but at a cost of making the city unaffordable to all but very few.
And I agree that there should be something done about these housing movements in the realm of public policy. What about investing in entrepreneurship and deregulation, which some proponents argue that it's essential to making housing more available and affordable?
Yeah, so completely agree. And so let's talk about a few of those things. One, on the deregulation. So I said at the start that rent control is one little piece of this puzzle. And in fact, it's a piece that probably gets outside attention relative to its contribution to the problem. So rent control laws are problematic, but they're not the biggest problem. And in many cases, they're a relatively small piece. But one thing that's much more common is just the regulations that are put in place that are that are sold as making the units of new housing safer or more environmentally friendly or whatever it may be. But when we put in requirements about how many parking spaces a building has to have, how many people can live on a given floor, what the number of floors, what's sometimes called the floor FSI, a floor space index, how many floors you can have per plot of land, or even just things like requiring each unit to have its own bathroom. Those restrictions drive up the price of any given unit, make it more expensive to build and then more expensive to rent. And removing some of those restrictions could have the impact of making it possible to build units at prices that people can more easily afford. And so a lot of the problem is on the regulation side in these areas.
And I know that in San Jose, California, the capital of the Silicon Valley and the city where I was born and raised, there has been debate about whether or not there should be more affordable housing through the building of more affordable housing homes or through high density housing. And there's been a push among new leaders and new leadership in San Jose, California for affordable housing complexes. And we can also go back to your documenting Basti and back to India. There's been a big push for housing complexes as well. What is your opinion, Professor, on the affordable housing complexes being built, being proposed in San Jose and even back in India?
Good question. So first, let me say that housing is an issue for me, which that I feel the same way about housing as I feel about immigration, which is our current policy is so far off the optimal level of housing provision or immigration that we can debate about the right strategies to increase immigration or to increase housing, but it doesn't really matter because it's so obvious that the answer is more. And so the exact optimal way to do more, I think, can be contestable. But the outcome that San Jose, San Francisco, the Bay Area entirely, but also much of the United States and much of the urban world generally just needs to build more housing to reduce these housing crunches. I think is the key thing. And so whatever political compromise can get reached to just start building more houses aggressively is important. Now, in India, in urban policy and slums, the issue is slightly different. And I think this is the issue in the documentary that you're asking about, which is one strategy that's existed in India to deal with, help address the problems of many residents of slums in India is to start what's so-called slum rehabilitation projects, which is the idea that you'll move people out of an existing slum and into an apartment building that the city builds and maintains. This is the kind of idea that I think would work well if done right. And I'm just afraid that it might not be really possible to do it right. Because what happens in practice is that the apartment buildings that get built are just in terrible conditions, and they're terribly maintained, and they're unclean, unsafe for the residents that live there. And they end up having this effect of sort of breaking up all of the assets that the slum dwellers have. What do I mean by that? So someone could be living in a slum where they run a small business from their house, and they're close with their neighbors, and their neighbors watch their kids, and they watch their neighbors, and they have a social network that will help them if someone has an unexpected bill or if someone gets sick. And then when slum rehabilitation comes along and we say, you have to get out of your particular house right now and move into this apartment that we're giving you across the city that's in terrible condition, not safe, not nice, it ends up having this consequence of both breaking up people's social networks such that they no longer have that deep, thick network, and making it difficult to run a business from their new small apartment. And so the track record of these SRA programs in India have been really quite mixed. And that, I think saying it's mixed is a charitable way to put it. And the comparison to have in mind for someone from the United States would have been the Slum Rehabilitation Act programs are reminiscent of the era of public housing in the United States, where the solution for low-income housing was to build so-called high-rise projects in cities like Chicago or New York or other places, most of which, or many of which at least in the city of Chicago where I live, have since been torn down and been seen as a bit of policy failures, where these high-rises were built, but they didn't do a great job providing safe environments for the people that live there. And I think India is going through a bit of that process right now in some of its cities.
And in some of the cities back in where I'm from, in near San Jose, Berkeley, Stockton, and in San Francisco, there's also been another public policy proposal through universal basic income. And I'm also aware in Chicago, there is some sort of basic income program being implemented out there. Could such a program like that work in India to cure some of the housing crisis out in the slums of India?
Yeah, great question. So this is currently a topic of a great amount of research in the development economics community. Now, the genesis of this thinking was originally a lot of development programs focused on giving people in need particular items. So we're going to give you mosquito nets so that you don't catch malaria. We're going to give you some amount of cooking oil so you can affordably cook your food, some amount of guaranteed food of grain or whatever it may be from the government so that you have enough food to eat, etc. Over time, some of the evolution on thinking turned into maybe it's just more efficient to give people cash, because when you give people cash, they don't have to like resell their grain on the secondary market if they have some need that month that's more important than the food, right? And it was just seen as potentially being a more efficient way to accomplish the goal of getting people what they need, because maybe we get it wrong how much cooking oil they need, or how much food they need, or how many mosquito nets, whatever, right? So the move towards just giving cash. Now, at first, in development economics, this has been in targeted ways. You identify the poorest communities and you give them the resources, whether or not it's the cooking oil and the food or the cash. The move towards UBI was to say, wait a second, when we do targeted cash assistance, often it's the case that we have to draw lines who does and doesn't get cash, and we get it right or we get it wrong. What if we just give the money to everybody, and then later in the tax system, if people earn more than some amount of money, we tax them that amount back, and do it in this way to ensure that it's happening. Now, there is, I think, greater acceptance of giving more support through direct cash instead of through in-kind transfers like cooking oil. And that's even happening in India. But a full UBI in a country of India's wealth right now, I think, is just pretty far from where the actual policy space is. And so this will be the kinds of things where some charities will experiment with, and some will try to do, randomized controlled trials to see the benefits. But I don't think this is meaningfully currently on the policy horizon on a country, on any country that's not extremely wealthy, but certainly of India's.
And for the vulnerable people depicted in the documentary, it is vital that we form its land use regulations, housing policies, and municipal services to protect these vulnerable communities. What are some of the necessary policies that you view will help India, and how do you think these lessons should be applied to federal policies in the United States of America?
Yeah, good question. So in India, so much of the issue is that there are policies in place that at least are justified as ways to help the poor, but often distort their markets, their reality, in ways that actually end up harming them. So let me give one more concrete example beyond housing, which is water subsidies. So in Mumbai, for instance, and this is true in big cities across India, there is a price that exists for water that households pay, a higher price that companies pay for the water that's delivered for their pipes, and another price that houses are supposed to pay if they're below poverty line households, right? So you're supposed to get a subsidy on your water. Your water is supposed to be cheaper if you're in a below poverty line house. And the idea then is that all of the businesses that pay above market rate will put money into the system by paying more than the cost of water. And then that extra money will subsidize the price for the poor. But what's happened in practice is that almost no one actually gets to pay the below poverty rate house, because people just don't build houses that have official water connections that service the poor. So the people that live in slums actually pay radically higher prices for water than any business does, because they have to buy it off the black market. They have to buy it from these water tankers that come into their communities and sell them just exorbitant prices. Now, the city of Mumbai has no interest, though, in setting up water connections to these poor houses, because they know every additional water pipe that they hook up will result on them losing money. That is, the city is already broke or has relatively little money. If you cook up a new poor household with water, you have to subsidize that water, and money goes out. Now, the poor people of Mumbai, of course, they would love to pay the subsidized price, but they would still save a fortune if they just paid the true market price for water instead of having to pay the exorbitant price they pay on the black market for water. In other words, the existence of the subsidy isn't what's helping the poor people there. It's making it impossible to live there. Now, in the US, we have some of the same problems, where we've created situations where we have policies that make incentives so the city does not want to actually help the poor. Now, in the US, here's one example that cuts across most major cities, which is the average cost to educate a kid in public school is something like $15,000 a year in the United States. Now, that varies from place to place. There's places that are more or less expensive. But that means that if you have a household that has 2 kids in public school, they cost $30,000 a year during the time that those kids are in school, right? Now, in many places, even quite wealthy people that have houses that are, $1 million house or something, don't pay $30,000 in property tax. And low-income houses pay way less than $30,000 in property tax. And property taxes is the way that we fund our schools. The result is is that every time a city like Chicago or San Francisco builds a new house where the property tax they collect is radically lower than the cost of educating the kids in school, the city finds ways to make excuses to not build those housings. Now, it might be because of environmental regulations. It might be because of concerns about the number of parking spaces. It might be some other set of permit reasons. But just predictably, again and again, the city finds a reason to not build the houses because of the subsidies that exist in a way that make it so that each new unit of housing creates a loss for the city in the way that we do this municipal finance. Now, if we restructure our municipal finance in both of these cases, water in India or schools in the US, this wouldn't be a problem, right? If we funded our schools at the state or the national level, we would be indifferent to whether or not people lived in Chicago or a suburb or wherever else, and we would just want them to move where it's best for their family. But by linking these choices at the local level to create a municipal finance problem for providing services, predictably, the services don't get provided. And so I think there's some of those lessons that might be more vivid in India, where people are extremely poor, but the same basic logic exists in our cities too.
Well, that's great to hear, and thank you again for having this wonderful conversation, Professor Chilton. This is the end of our time. And do you have any lasting words before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thanks for having me and for inviting me to have this conversation about its bounce between the US, the Bay Area, Chicago, and everywhere in between to talk about housing policy. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you everyone else for listening to this episode of The Robots Are Coming. Next time we'll have even more great professors like Professor Chilton speaking on the topics of public policy and technology and housing policies. So make sure you subscribe to The Robots Are Coming wherever you're listening to, and tell all of your friends to do that as well.